The place of children in critical theory and in life in general is something that is usually not treated with too much importance. But I think in wake of the burgeoning fields of post-colonial studies and generally having an eye out for subjugated peoples or cultures, children are viewed comparatively less. This has a lot to do with the value that we give people in general. Children are usually not valued in an absolute sense, insofar as they are considered being something which is an empty husk needing to be filled with ideals and cultural practices and turned into something that they are yet to be. Now, this may be true in a sense, but it's important to look at the way in which child rearing, of course, plays into the way in which we treat children. And in this lecture, I want to look at 4 thinkers and the way they look at children to get us a sense of how can we look at children in philosophy and critical theory as potentially the new horizon of a revolutionary group. We'll be looking at Kate Millett in an essay, Women, Homosexuals, and Youth, Latent Sexual Liberation. We'll be looking at the child as it appears in a section in Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra. We'll be looking at one paragraph in Jean Baudrillard's Fatal Strategies. And we'll be looking at a few sections in Deleuze and Guattari's A Thousand Plateaus. And these thinkers will all use children to various levels of realism. Sometimes it is treated more as a metaphorical model of revolution, and sometimes it's a little bit more of a realist eye towards the position that children are in society. Starting with Kate Millett. She was an important figure in the feminist movement and in the sexual liberation movement, and she begins her essay by saying, "A sexual revolution begins with the emancipation of women who are chief victims of patriarchy, and also with the ending of homosexual oppression. Part of the patriarchal family structure involves the control of the sexual life of children. Indeed, the control of children totally. Children have virtually no rights guaranteed by law in our society, and besides, they have no money, which, in a money economy, is one of the most important sources of their oppression. Certainly, one of children's essential rights is to express themselves sexually, probably primarily with each other, but with adults as well. So the sexual freedom of children is an important part of the sexual revolution. How do we bring this about? The problem here is that when you have an exploitative situation between adults and children, as you have between men and women, cross-generational relationships take place in a situation of inequality. Children are in a very precarious situation when they enter into relationships with adults, not only in a concrete material sense, but emotionally as well, because their personhood is not acknowledged in our society." And this is a very jarring essay for anyone. Maybe this is their first kind of feminist piece looking at, or kind of liberatory piece. And I've done a lecture on this essay, which I think if you actually go through that, you'll find this is actually a quite fruitful essay. But Kate Millett is pointing out here that latent within all these liberatory movements, there's a question of what is the next group to be liberated and what are the steps that need to be taken. And what is crucial here is the starting point of children as not having virtually any rights. Not only because they don't have money, but also because children are not deemed productive members of society. When the Industrial Revolution was occurring, child labor was normal. And as certain progressive movements came along, Gradually, they were labor laws put into place. But when you read these labor laws, they're actually not as humane as we might like to think, because one of the chief reasons that children were taken out of the factory is because they didn't meet a productive quota. They didn't have enough intelligence or education or problem-solving skills to make them valuable in a workforce. And that was what was important for these factories, is maximizing their productive output and the extraction of surplus value. So children are in an interesting place where they have to be civilized, so to speak, and filled with things, which makes them in a rather negative position insofar as they are seen as having value in the future for what they will become. And it's very difficult to ground in economic terms the inherent value of children, which perhaps, I would say certainly, points out the limitations of using an economic lens to look at the value of anything. And when it comes to not only sexual liberation, but liberation in general, we have to think about the fact that there are very real conditions which pervade society, which make it such that without substantive rights to back up a position of freedom, it's a rather vapid and empty claim. It's like having the right to vote, but not being given a ballot. It's just an abstract word at this point. In this essay, Kate points out, oh, sure, part of a free society would be that you could choose whomever you fancied, and children should be able to freely choose as well. But it's very hard to be free if you have no rights about anything, if you're subjected to endless violence, both physical and psychological, if you're already governed by a whole state system which demands that you put in forced attendance in school, whether you want to be there or not. I would think that given the conditions under which you're a young person in this society, many things would be at least as important to you as sexuality. And that's really important, that if a liberatory revolution or movement has any sense about it, it is going to start with the most material forms of freedom. Things like rights, and institutions which will uphold a sense of freedom, because otherwise we open up, in the case of children, an exploitative situation in which, for example, older men will take advantage of younger boys. That's something that Kate mentions throughout this essay. So we can see that from a very pragmatic starting point, there are a lot of things that make the child's position rather inopportune, insofar as it can often be difficult in a society that puts value in money or in productivity to ground a sense of rights that a lot of other groups have had to fight for precisely by immigrating, for example, and becoming productive working members. And over time, this grows on a society such that you say, oh, well, I guess they can have citizenship or rights because look at them being a hard worker. So in a society that is ruled by a work-based system of value, it can often be very difficult to give children a very substantive sense of rights. Now, in the case of Friedrich Nietzsche, there's one spot here at the beginning of the first part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, in which Nietzsche is talking about three metamorphoses, from the camel to the lion to the child. And these are basically three different modes of being, so to speak, ways of being in the world and orienting yourself towards the content of that world and shaping it in a liberatory way. And Nietzsche is deeply concerned about liberation in the same way that Kate might be. And Nietzsche says here, to create new values, that even the lion cannot do. But the creation of freedom for oneself for new creation, that is within the power of the lion. The creation of freedom for oneself and a sacred no even to duty. For that, my brothers, the lion is needed. to assume the right to new values. That is the most terrifying assumption for a reverent spirit that would bear much. Verily, to him it is praying, and a matter for a beast of prey. He once loved thou shalt as most sacred. Now he must find illusion and caprice, even in the most sacred, that freedom from his love may become his prey. The lion is needed for such prey. But say, my brothers, what can the child do that even the lion could not do? Why must the preying lion still become a child? The child is innocence and forgetting, a new beginning, a game, a self-propelling wheel, a first movement, a sacred yes. For the game of creation, my brothers, a sacred yes is needed. The Spirit now wills his own will, and he who had been lost to the world now conquers his own world. So there's a very interesting image of children going on here, in which the way Nietzsche talks about the lion, this is basically the destroyer who can go into a system and can freely say no to the burdens which have been placed on it, which will forsake the senses of duty which have been placed on it, and is going to raise them to the ground in defiance. And it's going to create its own values. Now, the thing that makes the child better than this is the lion will tend to become a nihilistic state. What is latent within the child for Nietzsche is the fact that it can forget that rules have been placed on it. It can start from a new position of creativity in which games are created. Think about a child who plays on the playground. They might have some background of games they've played before, but they'll make up new rules all the time, and they have no reason not to do so. They have no hermeneutic standing behind them, setting hard and fast lines, but instead is able to say yes to, oh, you want to play together? You want to play a new game? Of course I'll play a new game. And this is a profoundly creative activity that Nietzsche sees as being habitually an element of the child's conscience, to slip behind our categories and not do so purely out of defiance, but from an innocent position of simply instinctually creating. Now, Jean Baudrillard paints a quite interesting picture in which children are in the process of being coded, as I spoke of previously, of having behaviors put into them. But they have a possibility to surprise and go beyond our categories that for him is properly transgressive. They represent an ambiguity that we try to cover up when we turn children into productive members of society, and in doing so, we turn them into a perfectly unambiguous reproductive cog, whereas Baudrillard sees children as having an ambiguity built into their condition which we should not ignore. He says that you insult a child by being too sensitive to its age or strength. The child, deep down, knows he is not a child, and he is not concerned with the affectation of liberty and responsibility with which you wish to dignify him in order better to dignify the pedagogical difference between adult and child. He competes rather on equal terms. He is neither free nor inferior, and leaves it to others to believe that. He envelops you with his shamelessness, for which precisely all means are justified. He can choose to play up difference, to play the fragile child facing the adult, and you then owe it to him to protect him, to valorize him, to attenuate the difference. Or else at any moment he can choose to return you to the absence of difference, real and fundamental. Childhood doesn't exist. There is no child. He would be right in both cases. This confers upon him an absolute superiority. So, right, in a situation in which child rearing is taking place, the child will slip in between these states of being submissive and demanding of the parent to meet its needs. And it can do this in a way in which it almost solicits the parent's behavior. Yet sometimes it will engage, maybe this is simply making some comment or asking a very profound question in a rather unaware way, which leaves us baffled precisely by the fact that they get rid of that difference between the adult and the child in those moments of profound reality, creativity, that gets to the very core of the similarities that we try to separate when we, for example, say that, oh, you are on the path to becoming an adult, or you'll understand when you're older. It's a sort of patronizement that Baudrillard is not too keen on, because instead, the child is not inferior, and in fact doesn't believe in his own inferiority, but rather uses his position in a number of strategic ways, which takes advantage of the rules of the game and makes them explode from the inside out. And the ambiguity of whether or not you're being quote-unquote played by the child might be precisely the revolutionary kernel within the notion of childhood itself. Finally, on to Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. They mention the relationship between the young girl and the child and gender here in Becoming Intense, Becoming Animal, Becoming Imperceptible, which is one of the chapters from their seminal work, A Thousand Plateaus. And they're connecting to a lot of earlier themes, which makes the language rather jarring, but I think the profoundly creative point will speak for itself. And the point of children and what is called minoritarian groups in general, these subaltern positions, which are deemed less than by society, is precisely that those positions don't actually objectively exist. In the sense that when one makes a stereotype of a black person, for example, and say it's like blackface, and there's lots of pantomiming and stereotyping going on, that stereotype doesn't exist in the objective sense. It is a virtual fantasy of how the minoritarian group exists in the major discourse, how it is absorbed by society. But the important thing is that this is, of course, a very shallow interpretation of African American people, and there are always things which cannot be accounted for in such a caricature. There are behaviors which cannot be replicated, which, when the white person portraying blackface tries to absorb these behaviors, he simply can't. It makes a caricature out of the stereotyping actor simply by being faced by these non-overcodable behaviors or non-understandable behaviors without oneself slipping into a profound contact with this group, in which we see that same similarity that we saw in Baudrillard's work, where the child sometimes becomes transgressive. And here Deleuze and Guattari point out some of the construction that goes into our categories not only of man and women, but of course of children. They say the question is not, or not only, that of the organism, history, and subject of enunciation that oppose masculine to feminine in the great dualism machines. The question is fundamentally that of the body they steal from us in order to fabricate opposable organisms. This body is stolen first from the girl. Stop behaving like that. You're not a little girl anymore. You're not a tomboy, etc. The girl's becoming is stolen first in order to impose a history or prehistory upon her. The boy's turn comes next, but it is by using the girl as an example, by pointing to the girl as the object of his desire, that an opposed organism, a dominant history, is fabricated for him too. The girl is the first victim, but she must also serve as an example and a trap. That is why, conversely, the reconstruction of the body as a body without organs, the anorganism of the body, is inseparable from a becoming woman, or the production of a molecular woman. Now, lots of complicated stuff going on here, but the molecular woman is basically a code word for those behaviors that we spoke of that can't help but bring a contact between a majoritarian and a minoritarian group. In the case of men versus women, this is the non-overcodable behaviors. It's the little stuff that isn't literally becoming a woman, like switching sexes or something like that. It's the subtleties in mannerisms or action which testify to the profound similarity and the ability for these concepts, these dualism machines, as it's said, to be transgressed. And in the case of child rearing here, we see here there is a body which is in the process of creative production with the child, which is stolen, in a sense, of you can't act like that. You're not supposed to act like that. You do that when you're a child, but you're not a child anymore. Now you have to grow up and be a productive member of society. And Deleuze Guattari's point here is really, well, why do we have to be organized like that? Why do we have to have these organs, which would be binaries, ways of having to be in the world? Why do we have to have those forced upon us? Why can we not instead become a body without organs? Which is to say, look at the products that have been placed upon us and, like the child, embrace this creative possibility, this sacred yes-saying that Nietzsche speaks of. They go on, the girl is certainly not defined by virginity. She is defined by a relation of movement and rest, speed and slowness, by a combination of atoms, an emission of particles, Higgsity. She never ceases to roam upon a body without organs. She is an abstract line, or a line of flight. Thus, girls do not belong to an age group, sex, order, or kingdom. They slip in everywhere, between orders, acts, ages, sexes. They produce n molecular sexes on the line of flight in relation to the dualism machines they cross right through. The only way to get outside the dualisms is to be between, to pass between, the intermezzo. That is what Virginia Woolf lived with all her energies, in all of her work, never ceasing to become. The girl is like the block of becoming that remains contemporaneous to each opposable term, man, woman, child, adult. It is not the girl who becomes woman. It is becoming woman that produces the universal girl. And what's really important here is the line, the girl is like the block of becoming that remains contemporaneous to each opposable term. And I know this is extremely complex, but the way the girl specifically, because the girl is like the double minority, it's both a child and a woman. The girl represents in Deleuze Guattari's work a primordial intensity, a potential for revolutionary change that is within every organism. It is that metaphorical notion that Nietzsche spoke of, which is a mode of being in the world that is creative, that willingly, or rather unwillingly, forgets that rules have been placed on them, becomes a body without organs, becomes a line that can be drawn in a creative way instead of being imposed upon one, where a path is in the making. And this block of becoming is this state of creative possibilities, this open-ended discussion, which, remaining contemporaneous to each opposable term, means that in between man and woman, where man is the dominant term and woman is the non-dominant term, the subaltern term, the minoritarian term, in between these, the man is going to be constructed as some sort of ideal. Think about in the sense of rights to vote. Men were given the right to vote because they had rationality, but women didn't. Or they were financially responsible with their property, but women weren't, which women couldn't have property, so it's a false start, of course. But the man's position will become privileged and will create a hierarchy in which woman is inferior. It is a term which needs to become man, needs to be absorbed. But instead, Deleuze and Guattari want to ask, what about the becoming woman of the man? It's a contact in between these two opposable terms of a binary, of a particular way of being, that makes the dominant position shriek or fall back. And this can only be done through the creativity that is a regular feature of children themselves. In a final triumphant burst, Deleuze and Guattari state, "It is certain that molecular politics proceeds via the girl and the child. But it is also certain that girls and children draw their strength neither from the molar status that subdues them, nor from the organism and subjectivity they receive. They draw their strength from the becoming molecular they cause to pass between sexes and ages, the becoming child of the adult, as well as of the child, the becoming woman of the man, as well as of the woman. The girl and the child do not become. It is becoming itself that is a child or a girl. The child does not become an adult any more than the girl becomes a woman. The girl is the becoming woman of each sex, just as the child is the becoming young of every age. Knowing how to age does not mean remaining young. It means extracting from one's age the particles, the speeds and slownesses, the flows that constitute the youth of that age. Knowing how to love does not mean remaining a man or a woman. It means extracting from one's sex the particles, the speeds and slownesses, the flows, the N sexes that constitute the girl of that sexuality. It is age itself that is a becoming child, just as sexuality, any sexuality, is a becoming woman. In other words, a girl. And this is, of course, all very complex. The way they're using girl is very particular. It is becoming itself that is a child or a girl, which is to say, the ability for something to change, to become something new, to be creative. That is epitomized in the position of the girl or the child. The person who is in the subaltern position of needing to be filled with practices also takes their revenge precisely because they don't gain the strength from being a subdued category, nor do they have their creative potential because of an identity that has been imposed upon them. Rather, they draw their strength in the fact that every single category, every single dualism has an in-between, a becoming child or a becoming woman, that causes them to undergo a revolutionary change which is impossible to outstrip if we can look at every situation and, as they say, extract from one's age the particles, the speeds and slownesses, the flows that constitute the youth of that age. Which is to say, looking at the tendencies and rules which have been placed upon a certain category in the sense of the child, and being able to creatively toy with them and tinker with them. It's a profoundly revolutionary creativity, which is latent within every category. And thus, Deleuze and Guattari take to the extreme the revolutionary potential of childhood, the sacred yes-saying, which displays a radical possibility to engage us, to engage the stable categories that we think are eternal, in a becoming, and to be used as a creative model that is truly radical. So I hope this has been useful in terms of gaining a broader context for children and their liberatory potential in critical theory and philosophy today. There's so much more to be said, and we must keep in mind the very real problems facing children. Things like the foster care system, or abusive situations, and the lack of rights to substantively found a sense of liberation, all of which we should keep in mind by going back to Kate Millett's essay, of course. But I'll leave it at this, merely to give you some food for thought in terms of thinking of the ways in which this can figure into all sorts of political theory, critical theory, film criticism, whatever it may be, that can provide for a new revolutionary take on the possibility for change and creativity. Please watch any of my other lectures that I've done on postmodernism, feminism, post-colonial studies, German idealism. Leave any constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments below, and I'll see you in another lecture.